The historical and political definition of the Regency period is the period from 1811 to 1820, when George, Prince of Wales, governed the country as regent during the madness of his father George III. The decision to bestow the regency on George was not taken lightly. It was only after nearly 2.5 months of political wrangling that the title and the political powers of government were granted. The Act of Parliament conferring these powers was finally passed by a commission in the House of Lords on February 5, 1811, and the prince was formally sworn in as the regent at Carlton House the next day. He continued to rule as the regent until 1820 when, on his father's death, he assumed the title George IV and reigned until his own death in 1830. There were many political developments that led to the Regency era. In 1789, the French Revolution began, and this caused fear among other European monarchs, including Britain. As the British government feared radical uprisings, they repressed calls for democratic reforms. The government was largely controlled by the Tories, emphasizing conservatism, monarchy, and Anglican church authority. This was also the high point of colonialism, because Britain was expanding its empire, particularly in India under the East India Company. Rapid industrial growth led to urbanization and the rise of new wealth, but this also created tensions between working class and the aristocracy, and between the aristocracy and the landed gentry and the neo-rich. Britain's powerful Royal Navy controlled the seas. This was the time period when British Navy was the strongest navy in the world, and it was making it difficult for Napoleon to invade or directly attack the British Isles. Napoleon's response to British naval dominance was called the Continental System. He sought to cripple its economy and military power through a combination of naval blockades, economic embargoes, and by undermining its allies on the continent. His goal was to establish French dominance in Europe and challenge Britain's position as the leading global power. All this lasted from 1793 to 1815, where Britain engaged in Napoleonic wars against France. Within this period, in 1801, the Act of Union united Great Britain and Ireland, forming the United Kingdom. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself as the Emperor of France. In 1813, British forces defeated the French in Spain during the Peninsular War. In 1814, Napoleon was exiled, and temporary peace came in Europe. But in 1815, Napoleon came back and returned to power, but finally was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo. The Napoleonic Wars enveloping the country until late 1815, and the Industrial Revolution with its growth of railways and factory system, brought mass unemployment. This, combined with bad harvest of 1816 and a population boom, led to widespread poverty. Much of the urban population lived in crowded slums, known as rookeries, such as St. Giles in London. In these neighborhoods, gambling, prostitution, alcoholism, theft, and violence became increasingly rife during the later years of the Regency period, when police were sometimes even afraid to enter without armed backup. So while the wealthy, privileged class enjoyed all the refinements of Regency culture, the working classes were desperately poor, with an average lifespan of approximately 22 years. Nevertheless, the Industrial Revolution brought with it medical advances that lowered infant mortality rate, while other effects of urban life also contributed to an explosion in city populations. Political power for much of this period was held by landed gentry. Whigs brought in the Great Reform Act of 1832, which gave many more people the right to vote, but explicitly excluded women. More positively, thanks to the leadership of William Wilberforce, the abolition of slavery enjoyed rising support. One of the most beloved activities of the aristocratic and the wealthy, all through the long Georgian era, was dancing. It was considered an essential accomplishment for both ladies and gents, including even military gentlemen, not just for the sake of dance itself, but to have the proper elegance and poise in society. In fine families, children were taught by dancing masters as well as at school if they attended one. In large private mansions and country houses, balls were also an opportunity to show off wealth and compete to host the most sought-after ball of the season. Who was and who wasn't invited was to be noted. On the other hand, spontaneous smaller eruptions of dancing might also happen in any drawing room by just moving the furniture aside. There was also something known as being out of a lady. Being out was an event to announce a young lady as accepting the attentions of young gentlemen. By the time a girl was 16 in the country, she would probably be going to dinner with neighbors and eating dinner with family when there was company at home. In the later years of the 1700s and up to 1811, the Queen hosted regular drawing rooms when young ladies were presented to her for approval before making their come-outs. We see a hint of this when the imperious Lady Catherine de Borough, in Pride and Prejudice of Jane Austen, was shocked to learn that all the Bennet sisters were out in the society at the same time.
Your younger sisters, are they out in society?
Yes, Ma'am, all.
All? Would all 5 out at once? Oh, that's very odd. And you only the second. The younger ones out before the eldest are married. Your youngest sisters must be very young.
Yes, my youngest is not 16.
1815 was also the time when the Prince Regent was reigning in England. George IV was known for his extravagance and disinterest in ruling. He was a monarch whose reign was marked by scandal and financial excess, though he had a keen interest in art and architecture. He was known for his lavish speaking and pursuit of pleasure. His marriage to his wife was a disaster, and he attempted unsuccessfully to divorce her, causing further scandal and damaging his image. Despite his personal opinion, George IV was forced to assent to the Catholic Emancipation of 1829, which granted Catholics the right to be elected to the Parliament. George IV was a significant patron of arts, acquiring important works of art and commissioning architectural projects like the transformation of the Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace. He actively encouraged new movements in painting, sculpture, literature, music, and technology. If we look at the developments in the women's rights movements, the women writers of the first generation of Romantic period that lasted from 1790 to 1810 were significantly different from the women writers of the second generation of the Romantic period between 1811 and 1832. The first generation of Romantic women writers, responding to the Enlightenment claim for universal rights and the Jacobean ideology of French revolutionary philosophies, initiated what we recognize to be a feminist movement, a demand for the rights of women. Mary Wollstonecraft's pleas for the early education of women, the admission of women into professions, even the suffrage for women, were certainly heard by her contemporary women writers. Almost all women writers of the 1790s agreed that women should become more rational in their choice of husbands and in the fulfillment of their domestic duties. By 1811, the political and cultural climate of Britain had undergone a radical change from the heady days of the early 1790s. Napoleon's campaigns and the paranoid British political response, coupled with the illness of reigning monarch George III, had made it far more difficult to imagine the realization either of Wollstonecraft's utopian program for the liberation of women or the revolutionary democracy celebrated by Blake, Wordsworth, Godwin, and their peers. Regency women wrestled with the same disillusion as did the male writers, but with a difference. The second generation of male poets, Percy Shelley, Byron, Keats, and Hunt, struggled to sustain a belief in the possibilities of political and imaginative freedom in the face of a relentless political oppression. Their work reflects their increasing skepticism, both on the political and the aesthetic level. Women writers saw their own hopes for even minor improvements in the education and social treatment of women disappointed. They had a shared recognition that any gains in the education and social stature of women would have to come from within the domestic sphere rather than from overt political action. Their writing engaged in a practice that we would now recognize as a conscious raising, an effort to persuade individual readers to question the social construction of gender in local and personal ways. Several female novelists developed what we might call the knowledge novel, or the novel of education. Novels that include long sections devoted to recapitulations of history, politics, science, or the arts. Novels that make accessible to their female readers intellectual information not otherwise available to them. The writers under this were Jane Porter and Lady Morgan. A third group of female writers in the Regency period produced what we call silver fork or fashionable novels, exposés of the licentiousness, financial corruption, and social mores of the aristocratic class. These novels are usually read as little more than the celebrations of the lives of the rich and famous of the day, but they often contain a trenchant critique of vanity and debauchery of the Prince Regent's coterie, Catherine Gore's Women as They Are, or The Manners of the Day, and Mary Shelley's later novels like L'Adore and Faulkner are fine examples of this genre. The women writers of the Regency period thus create a literary culture that marks a notable transition from a commitment to the utopian visions of Mary Wollstonecraft and culminating in Aikin's claim that only maternal love can save the human species from extinction. It is a movement towards an acceptance of the more socially pragmatic program of Hannah More, of the vision that women can best serve society in the domestic role of the rational, moral educators and active community philanthropists. This is what we have come to see as the Victorian Lady Bountiful. But Regency women writers embraced More's program with more awareness of its personal cost than More herself did. They recognized that women who devoted themselves to the domestic affections were frequently disappointed, rejected, not only by abandonment or departure of a particular lover, husband, brother, or child, but more globally by a rising tide of commercial and military expansion that forced men to leave their families to devote themselves primarily to making a fortune and to produce an ever more class-stratified society. All the issues that I've discussed so far have an increasing conformity to the domestic ideology as a backlash against the heady feminist optimism of the 1790s. The continuing, but too frequently frustrated desire to improve the education of women, the effort to restore a moral dimension to British public and especially political life in the face of Prince Regent's notorious licentiousness, are, of course, at the core of the fiction of the finest female writer of the Regency period, Jane Austen. This was all about the Regency, the political period, and the literature found in Regency period. If you'd like to know more about particular writers in the Regency period, have a look at this lecture about Jane Austen.